I talk about type 2 hypothyroidism, and the big question is, am I freaking crazy? So let's see. First thing you guys already know, I'm not an endocrinologist, so this is just a little thumbnail CV for anybody who hasn't seen it before, which I think all of you guys have. Um, and I just want to say I don't have any conflicts of interest or financial entanglements to discuss. I also want you to know that I am a level of evidence agnostic. About 10 years ago, they were all over that crap. I think it's bogus. And so just consider all my references low level, three, and read my citations, okay? Now, here's a problem with research. There's several ways of the data can be manipulated to influence the viewer. One of them is just emotional. I got this big 48% of Kentucky nursing homes are below average off of a TV commercial from a lawyer. Actually, it's 49% if he wants to be accurate. Of course, half are below average, right? The How to Lie with Statistics is a wonderful book from the 1950s. He's mostly talking about how politicians lie. Um, Dana, you and Bruce Goder has turned me on to science fictions. It's written by a British professor of psychology recently, and it's full of stuff that is amazing. A Christmas tree effect and pea hacking and things I had never considered. So, just for the person walking into medical statistics, I thought that Graeber and Wilbur had an outstanding section in their family practice exam and board review that I had to read from to take my exam to get my South Carolina license once upon a time. So, again, this was given to the same group that asked me to write the Diagnose and Treat Hypothyroidism lecture, and there's the place that my friend Riffet has it on YouTube, or just search my name, YouTube, and hypothyroidism. And frankly, I don't think I can give a better lecture on hypothyroidism. And so I've just decided to take on the question that I raised at the end of that lecture. Is there such a thing as type 2 hypothyroidism? And I want you guys all to know that we're entering a controversial zone. So there are four ideas I think are important today. Number one, some people are going to need to take T3 to get their best clinical results. Secondly, the ratio of total T3 to reverse T3 is the best indicator of actual thyroid hormone function in the body. And I'll give you all the references, of course, coming up. Third is that thyroid hormone doses really have to be divided at least every 12 hours, even if you're only giving levothyroxine, by the way. And finally, therapeutic blood levels on patients taking thyroid hormone really ought to be tested according to peak and trough fluctuations. And every internist will agree with me, and every family practice doc will say it's unnecessary. But believe me, it's important, and I test midway between doses. So, what am I talking about when I say type 2 hypothyroidism? I think it's analogous to type 2 diabetics. As I learned in my sophomore pathology, they have plenty of insulin, even high insulin, but it doesn't work and their glucose is high. So, for different reasons, which I'll explain, type 2 hypothyroid patients are sick and they've got plenty of thyroid hormone, T4, and a normal TSH. Unfortunately, there's not a single test like A1C or glucose. And because it's not easy to test it, many docs simply don't recognize the issue. Type 2 hypothyroidism is an abnormality of thyroid hormone processing. So, I'm sorry, guys, I got to take you back to the boring part. Let's do a review of normal physiology. The thyroid gland makes hormones using the aromatic amino acid L-tyrosine, which is in a big long protein chain called thyroglobulin, and it welds elemental iodine onto the cyclic ring of tyrosine, as this little nice illustration from the Colorado State uh, book uh, shows. So here's the L-tyrosine on the thyroglobulin, and the TPO enzyme bostages on iodines to the 3 and 5 carbons of the cyclic ring. And then two cyclic rings are joined. And now you've got a thyroid hormone on the thyroglobulin. See, these two guys come in conjunction, and an ether link is created between them. There's the ether link. Presto. Thyroglobulin, with its contained thyroid hormone, is stored extracellularly in the colloid follicles, and a thyroid gland carries about a 3-month supply. Thyroid hormone production is regulated by feedback. When the circulating thyroid hormone drops below a certain level, the hypothalamus makes thyrotropin releasing hormone, or TRH, which then travels down to the anterior pituitary gland and stimulates the pituitary thyrotrophs. Now, the thyrotrophs also assay the circulating thyroid hormone for confirmation. They go on information from two witnesses, which is in accordance with biblical texts, and then it produces thyroid stimulating hormone. TSH upregulates every single function of thyroid cells. In other words, it's trophic. And it especially causes the release of stored hormone in the thyroglobulin and the creation of new thyroid hormone in the thyroglobulin. So when TSH stimulates the thyrocyte, the release of thyroid hormone from storage takes a couple of steps. There's a pinocytic bite of colloid that's taken by the thyrocyte, even though it got no teeth, an old Cajun joke. And then the pinocytic vesicle is joined by a lysosome. Enzymes in the lysosome break up the thyroglobulin, releasing the thyroid hormone, and by the way, increasing the activity of thyroid hormone. And then it releases free hormones into the bloodstream where more than 99% bind to proteins, which makes the hydrophobic, aromatic thyroid hormone easily carried in the bloodstream, and it prevents it from liver metabolism and flushing out of the kidneys. Now, when I said it increases potency, you guys already know, I hope, there are several forms of thyroid hormone, and they're made several different ways. The iodination of tyrosine cyclic rings doesn't always saturate both of the potential binding sites, the 3 and 5 carbons. Most rings do get to iodine atoms, and those are called DITs, diiodothyronine. Do you guys remember DITs and MITs from your freshman year at med school? I do. I had no idea they would be important to me, though. Only a few rings get only one. It's a monoiodothyronine. And then when the rings are joined, of course, diiodo, iodo, and diiodo is the most common. And so most thyroid hormones has 4 iodine atoms, and we call it T4 because it's a lot easier than calling it 3,5, 3 prime, 5 prime tetraiodothyronine. T4, thank you. But when a monoiodo joins a diiodo, then your thyroid hormone doesn't get 4 iodines, it only gets 3. And due to conformation forces, the way shit likes to be put together biochemically, 90% of the thyroid hormone with 3 iodines has the monoiodo on the outer ring. And this is called T3 because of its 3 iodine atoms. And kinetically, in other words, rotationally, I want you to imagine this is the inner diiodo and this is the outer monoiodo ring, and it doesn't wiggle much. It just kind of swings a little bit like this. So it's a fairly stable molecule. All right. But there are 10% made with the mono on the inner and the di on the outer ring. And this is a wobbly damn molecule. It's very unstable and it doesn't behave the way T3 does. And so that's an important reason for the difference in function. Now, What's stored in the colloid is different from what's released into the bloodstream. And this is a really important point our colleagues in endocrinology miss. So I'm going to tell you, so you've heard it once, thyroid hormone stored in the colloid has 15 times more T4 than T3. When TSH tells the thyroid cell to release thyroid hormone, those lysosomal enzymes in the thyrocyte will convert some of the T4 to T3 so that when hormones are released into the bloodstream, they have 10 times more T4 than T3, not 15. And also, there is 10 times more T3 than reverse T3. This is old work and has been repeated a number of times, and so you can take it to the bank. And you have 90% T4, which turns out to be a pre-hormone, 9% T3, which is the biologically active form, and 0.9% reverse T3, 1/10 as much as T3. And we'll talk about it a lot because it is really misunderstood. And I think that little tiny bit of T3 is probably nothing, although some people claim it has some virtue. So why are there multiple types of thyroid hormones? Because they do different jobs, okay? As I said, T4 is a pre-hormone. It's activated when enzymes remove one iodine atom from the outer ring to make T3. The enzyme is called a 5' deiodinase because this is the prime ring out here. And T3 is 5 times more potent than T4. And this is based on old work and it's never been denied. Now, turns out this is important for us to keep precious. 80% of daily T3 comes from the deiodination of T4 by enzymes in the cytoplasm of our peripheral tissues. Thank you, Dr. Chopra. Now, why would a gland waste its time releasing a pre-hormone instead of making the active deal? Well, it's for the same reason Campbell's company put soup in a can instead of trying to sell you a hot steaming bowl at Kroger. A can is easy and safe to transport. It's got a really long shelf life. And anytime you want soup, you can open it. The catch here is if you have a can opener, okay? So I've said T4 is a pre-hormone. This brings me to another key concept. The activation of T4 to T3 is not random, as Sirks thought it was in 1971. It's just one of many options, and those options are regulated, okay? The second option is that T4 can be inactivated. So your thyroid gland makes more than it needs because what you don't need will just be broken down through what Chopra calls alternative pathways via deamination, decarboxylation, ether link cleavage, or very commonly conjugation with the sulfoxyl group, SO4. Now, turns out that 20% of the T4 that's released by the thyroid gland is unnecessary, and so it is simply removed by this alternative pathway process, mostly by conjugation in the liver. Yet another option is that T4 can be converted to reverse T3 by removing the iodine from the 5 locus on the inner ring, right here where lightning is striking, and it makes that unstable floppy molecule reverse T3. RT3 is the key to this whole concept of this lecture of type 2 hypothyroidism. See, a lot of people think reverse T3 is just an inactivation product of T4. That's 1970 thought. Research has in fact repeatedly shown that reverse T3 is a competitive inhibitor of T3 acting at the nuclear thyroid receptor. Plus, it has some other non-genomic actions. So just like a Marvel hero, I want to give you the origin stories of thyroid hormones. 100% of T4 comes from the thyroid gland. But most T3 and RT3 are not. They are derived from the T4 by these deiodinase enzymes located out in the peripheral tissues. They were first discovered in the liver, then the kidney. Basically, every tissue they've ever studied has one or the other or three. 80% of the T3 we use in every day comes from T4 by removing that one iodine atom from the outer ring. So there is T4, there is T3. And about 95% of reverse T3 in our circulation comes when the iodine atom is removed from the inner ring by 5-deiodination. These transformations are performed in the cytoplasm of cells by a very elegant system of enzymes that are purposefully directed. And this process is said to be the primary means of regulating the biological activity of thyroid hormone. It's not TSH. It's not the production of T4. It's the activation or inactivation of T4. So this purposeful direction is very efficient. The 5' enzymes that convert T4 to T3. Here's T4, here's T3. So these two guys have 5' deiodinase effect, and they not only make T3, but they get rid of reverse T3 down to T2, which is basically bupkis. Now, the 5-deiodinase enzymes that deactivate T4 by converting it to reverse T3, these two enzymes have 5-deiodinase effect, also break down T3 to an inactive T2. So it's very efficient. The actions of these enzymes are differentially regulated, and T3 and reverse T3 are antagonists. So we are walking around as living examples of the Tao, yin and yang, positive and negative, agonist and antagonist. And the analogy to this is testosterone. Testosterone is a pre-hormone that's either converted to muy macho DHT or mus feminina estradiol. Okay? A regulated process. Now, the mechanisms of action of thyroid hormone, the genomic, in other words, the effects on DNA, are way the most important. Here's a very nice little article on that. T3 joins the thyroid receptor in the cell nucleus, and that union creates a transcription factor which goes to a thyroid response element on the DNA and unzips the strands of DNA, thereby making RNA, activating DNA programs that will increase our metabolism. And by the way, they flop over and block any DNA message that slows the metabolic rate. So T3 revs up the metabolism and gets rid of any hindrance. T3 is also the main thyroid hormone that acts on mitochondria to give us some energy. T4 by itself has very little genomic effect, but it has some useful non-genomic activity on like cell membrane receptors and ion pumps. So what about reverse T3, Big Al? Well, the dogma of our organizations says, based on 1971 thought, that reverse T3 is simply an inactive breakdown product of excess T4, gotten rid of by the alternative pathways, also. But they're ignoring medical research, I'll show you later, that has repeatedly shown that while reverse T3 definitely does not stimulate the thyroid receptor, it is an inhibitory hormone that antagonizes T3. And it also has non-genomic effects, much like T4. So, man, dog, Big Al, am I claiming medicine has it wrong? Yeah, yes, I am. And I'm going to tell you, it sure as hell isn't the first time organized thyroidology has blown it. Let me show you. Way back in the 19th century, they had no idea what the thyroid gland was. They thought it was some kind of an outgrowth from the nervous system. And then, with anesthesia advances and Coker's incredible surgical skills, he is very self-satisfied. Look at that expression on Maggie over there. Coker was able to remove these gigantic, crippling Swiss goiters. This is an illustration from his first article on it. And they had no idea what was causing it. It was iodine insufficiency. It was unknown. So when Coker planned this operation, he was thinking about anesthesia risks and the huge bleeding. So he trusted his surgical skills. We still use Coker clamps, by the way, to stop bleeding. And the results, however, of thyroidectomy were not anticipated. Postoperatively, the patients could breathe great, they could swallow, they didn't have thyroids bigger than their boobs, but they became surgically hypothyroid. And this was especially obvious in children, and it mimicked the syndrome of congenital hypothyroidism. And by 1883, they were calling it artificial cretinism because the poor cretins were considered the stupidest people in Europe. Through creating surgical hypothyroidism, Coker proved that myxedema or Gall's disease was hypothyroidism. And drawing on Brown-Séquard's work, which is a sad but funny story, patients were restored to health by being given injections of extracts of sheep thyroid glands. As early as 1890, the Italians beat the British to it by about 6 months to the publication. And by 1901, Sir William Osler, the greatest physician of the 20th century, was giving oral desiccated thyroid extract, so-called natural thyroid, and he gave it divided TID. I'd like you guys to remember that for later. Now, how was it all regulated? Well, it took decades before doctors were willing to accept the truth of the hypothalamic pituitary thyroid axis. Harvey Cushing knew because he went in there to take out pituitary tumors. And as early as 1912, he described the post-op patients as going into a form of hibernation. By 1930, most neurosurgeons had accepted Cushing's idea of the pituitary thyroid axis, but it took until the 1950s before it really could be proven. And it was the three guys was a Tulane man, so we were all very happy when the 1977 Nobel Prize was awarded to one of our own. Now, during this whole HPT discovery, thyroid hormones were being studied, and the most abundant T4 was isolated as early as 1915. They published the structure of it incorrectly in 1925, and when they realized, oh shit, it's aromatic, then they got it right in 1927. But for years, researchers couldn't understand why a hormone that came from thyroid colloid was so much more potent than an equal amount of pure T4. The answer came in 1952, when I was born. T3 was identified in humans, and its power to suppress TSH was found to be 5 times stronger than T4. So by 1955, T3 was acknowledged by all as, yeah, it's the most active form of thyroid hormone, but it was considered unimportant because there was so damn little T3. Remember, that's picograms per mil. That's 10 to the minus 12. That ain't much. So the in vivo conversion of T4 to T3 was actually correctly described in 1951 and then again in 1955, but mutinous junior authors retracted the 1955 paper, pulled it out from underneath the senior author, and they did it incorrectly in 1958. So it wasn't until 1970 that Louis G. Braverman was able to prove the validity and the importance of the conversion of T4 to T3 in the human body. And I can tell you later how he did it if you're dying to know. So Gross was the guy who figured it out. And finally, after 1970, everybody could say, you know, Gross was right. T4 is a pre-hormone with little metabolic activity other than by being transformed to T3. And Ingbar restated this and confirmed it in the version of Harrison's principles that I studied my internal medicine from at Tulane. Further research later defined the non-genomic effects, first of T4, then of RT3. Not so much T3, okay? Now, let's look at RT3. It was discovered and synthesized in 1955 by some very clever Frenchmen. And by 1959, one study had reported that reverse T3 inhibited the effects of thyroid hormone, but basically it was ignored. Most studies never considered the possibility of inhibition because they didn't have the concept of antagonistic versions of hormones then. They just tested reverse T3 to see if it stimulated like T4 and T3 and even T2 a little bit, and they found It had none, absolutely no stimulating effect. So the idea that reverse T3 was irrelevant then was reinforced by the trouble everybody had even measuring the stuff. Nowadays, they do liquid chromatography tandem mass spec. It's damn hard to measure. And anyway, they said, nah, reverse T3 is evanescent. It doesn't linger. You can't measure it. It's just of no value. And so these are the ideas that led to the current thyroid treatment methods, most recently summarized by American Family Physician in 21. We are taught T4 is a pre-hormone, and it's activated only as needed. But they say any excess T4 is eliminated as inactive waste. That inactive is not quite right. And therefore, any treatment with T4 is bound to be safe and effective. So everybody should use T4. Plus the fact that Synthroid, Abbott Labs in those days, funded almost all thyroid research in the 50s and 60s and 70s. Now, the second thing they say, which isn't really true, is that T3 is the active thyroid hormone, yes, and it has a shorter half-life, yes, but its therapeutic use is riskier. Huh. Only if you want to use it once a day in large doses. Then they also said, totally incorrect, reverse T3 should be ignored because it has no stimulating effect. It's randomly produced in tiny amounts. It's soon gone, so ignore it. But a lot of these things, as I've just pointed out, are incorrect. Let's start by looking at patients who do not respond well to T4 only treatment. The Lithuanian Bonavicius in 99 and then again in 2000 reported benefits from adding T3 to patients' T4 treatment in general hypothyroid patients and then in psychiatric patients. But promptly in 2003, 3 studies disagreed. Oh no, that crazy Lithuanian guy doesn't know what he's talking about. And they were published in primo journals also. But then a Brit named Paniker came along. He didn't panic. He reported finding that 16% of his hypothyroid patients had a mutated deiodinase type 2 gene, requiring the addition of T3 to get good treatment results. DIO2 codes the type 2 deiodinase enzyme that makes from 50 to 70% of our T3. Huh. And then shortly afterwards, there's a 2012 review of the literature, and they came to the conclusion that combined treatment with T4 and T3 gave people the best results. And then 5 years later, the Endocrine Society concluded, yep, some patients need treatment with both T4 and T3. How about that? So let's take a look at reverse T3. Although almost everybody dismissed it, Chopra didn't. Chopra proved RT3 is not evanescent. It hangs around a lot. And that human deiodination of T4 produces significant amounts of RT3 as well as T3. And he speculated as early as 1974, maybe reverse T3 isn't just a inactivation product, but maybe it's involved in physiological regulation and the biological action of thyroid hormone. And he was totally on the money. So we ask, is reverse T3 like an automobile's brake pedal? T3 the accelerator, RT3 the brakes? Well, in 1974 came out the first published evidence that the conversion of T4 to either T3 or reverse T3 can be not randomly but adaptively modulated by physiopathological events. You see, in that paper, it was described that starving people were found to have a lot less T3 and a lot more RT3 relative to the precursor T4. Huh. And so there's a flurry of paper all through the 70s on this in all different situations. Starvation, heart attacks, chronic illness, extreme severe illness, cancer. And this was called the low T3 first. And then when they found that the T3 wasn't always low, they called it the Euthyroid Sick Syndrome or non-thyroidal illness in the 80s and 90s, and they've come back to euthyroid sick more recently. Now, In 2005, the primary importance of deiodination in regulating thyroid hormone potency was actually stated by a number of different papers. So the inhibitory role of reverse T3 has taken decades to define and still is not widely accepted for clinical use. And I'm going to tell you how we can do it. So here's a list of things that our academics got wrong. They thought thyroid gland was non-functional nervous tissue. They did a total thyroidectomy for an iodine deficient enlargement of the gland, which was still producing plenty of thyroid hormone until they took it out. Unanticipated results of the surgical hypothyroidism, the injection of hormones that were well tolerated orally. They got the structure wrong before they got it right. They had delays for decades accepting the HPT axis. T3 was believed to be unimportant because there wasn't much of it. They didn't appreciate the conversion of T4 to T3. Many people's need for T3 added to T4 was discounted, and still medicine states reverse T3 has no function. So am I saying that we are wrong about this also? That's what I'm saying. Let's look at some evidence. The first evidence came from Smith, an Aussie, who showed that while yes, RT3 cannot displace T3 that is bound to the nuclear thyroid receptor, published in a very prime journal, the second half of his experiment, when he gave RT3 first, he showed that no, T3 cannot displace RT3 that blocks the thyroid receptor. And this was so weird, editorial bias led him to have to publish that in the Australian Journal of Experimental Biology Medical Sciences. So in other words, the off the tailgate outback journal of irreproducible results. But the fact remains that whichever gets there first dominates the thyroid receptor. This is analogous to histamines and antihistamines at the histamine 1 receptor. You know, when you have a patient with sinus and you give them antihistamines for their allergies, it doesn't work immediately. It takes up to 2 weeks to have full effect because the antihistamine cannot displace histamine that is bound to the H1 receptor. So they just stabilize the allergic reaction and keep it from getting worse. And then over the next week or two, it keeps a person from having all of that histamine suffering, even though the ragweed is still in the air, as it is right now. Antihistamines prevent allergic reactions if you give them the week before ragweed comes into season because histamine cannot displace antihistamine from the H1 receptor either. So just like T3 and RT3, whoever gets there first is the boss. Now, Big Al, is there such a thing as an inhibitory thyroid hormone? I mean, we all know that estradiol is antagonistic to testosterone, but come on. So the answer is yes. It is well accepted that a thyroid hormone metabolite called 3-monoiodothyronamine can indeed block the genomic effects of T3, and this is all done by one of the Mahatmas of thyroidology, Professor Corley from Charity Hospital in Berlin. Reverse T3 genomic effects are consistent with inhibition of T3 by competition for the nuclear thyroid receptor. And about every 10 years, somebody else discovers this. And they think it's their new discovery because this stuff is all buried in the medical literature, just like their new discovery will be buried and somebody else will find it 7 or 10 years later and get excited. So if high reverse T3 slows the metabolism, Big Al, what about low reverse T3? Does it speed up the metabolism? And the answer is yeah, and in an unexpected place. Patients with HIV/AIDS develop low reverse T3, and I have no idea why, but it's repeatedly demonstrated as their infection gets worse and worse. And these people still have a normal T3, but a falling reverse T3, and that changing ratio correlates with weight loss repeatedly and with a hypermetabolic state featuring increased resting energy expenditure, increased protein breakdown, and 22% greater protein synthesis, which are all genomic actions of T3. How about them apples? So here's a newer concept from more recent research, reverse T3 has many non-genomic roles. And it turns out that thyroid hormones influence cell functions in other ways than just altering the transcription of thyroid responsive DNA. So here are some studies looking at the non-genomic effects of reverse T3, a few of which are actually opposed by T3, maintaining this yin and yang piece. Reverse T3 also inhibits both of the enzymes that convert T4 to T3, type 2 deiodinase, which makes the majority of T3, and type 1 deiodinases, which can make up to half of the T3. And what I think is really cool is these same 5' deiodinase enzymes also break down reverse T3 to T2. So that when reverse T3 blocks these enzymes, it perpetuates itself and it gets rid of the competition. Now, interesting other roles for reverse T3, and I'm honestly not certain whether this is genomic or non-genomic, but in the fetus, the balance of T3 and reverse T3 determines proliferation versus differentiation. This work was originally done in amphibian limb buds and in amphibian ophthalmic and otic capsules. In the very early fetus, reverse T3 dominates. In fact, reverse T3 has been called fetal thyroid hormone. And when reverse T3 dominates, they proliferate, proliferate, proliferate. But then, when there are the right number of cells by some mechanism that I have never seen explained, suddenly T3 is made and reverse T3 is blocked. And when T3 comes on the scene, the cells stop proliferating, they all differentiate, which I think is fascinating. Now, reverse T3 also directs fetal central nervous system development and the outgrowth of some of the tracts. So, if normal reverse T3 directs fetal development, would a low reverse T3 contribute to malformations? And the answer is, maybe, because there are a couple of studies from France describing the fact that children with Down syndrome have significantly low reverse T3 at birth. Well, shit. They never did the research to follow up on a causal linkage because I guess they couldn't get the grant. But they have suggested that maybe the lack of reverse T3 in these Down kids is why they didn't cook right. I'm sorry if I just offended somebody who works for the Down syndrome. Um, High reverse T3 is also associated with cell proliferation and wound healing. How about that? And in some cancers. There are actually a number of studies now showing that reverse T3 causes significant proliferation of cancer cells. Now remember, carcinoma cells are undifferentiated and rapidly dividing, and they act like embryonic or fetal cells. And cancer, like fetal tissue, has long been associated with high reverse T3 and even low T3 in circulation. And some tumors, particularly neonatal hemangiomas, can make so much type 3 deiodinase and reverse T3, they actually cause consumptive hypothyroidism that gets treated with T4. Wow. So let's look at some human evidence on the importance of reverse T3. Now, we've known for a long time that on the ICU, reverse T3 predicts a bad outcome. And that 2001 American Journal of Medicine study was interesting, Freiberg and all. But you see, if you look only at the reverse T3 level, it's insensitive. It really is not a sensitive assay. And so Peters took a look at this. Robin Peters, genius endocrinologist from Belgium. The Low Countries are good with endo. Actually, I think he's Dutch. The proof of dysfunctional deiodination was a study Peters did on the ICU, and he looked at high reverse T3, and yeah, that was a significant indicator of a bad outcome, but a low T3-RT3 ratio was 10 times more significant than just an elevation of reverse T3 by itself. And then, in fact, it's been subsequently stated that total T3-RT3 ratio is a better indicator of thyroid hormone signaling than is TSH. Wowza. I think when TSH is high, it's bad, but you can have a bad T3 RT3 with a normal TSH, making it the ratio more important. So, I can't read the title to my slide because of the way things are put out here, but I think this is a little summary. I want you to know that all T4 is made in the thyroid, just a little T3 and a very little RT3 are made in the thyroid. So exiting the thyroid gland, there is 10 times more T3 than reverse T3. But in circulating blood, where 80% of T3 is derived from T4 and 95% of RT3 comes from T4, in circulation, there is 12 times more T3 than reverse T3. And peripheral deiodination of T4 and of T3 and RT3 is the primary means of regulating the biological activity of T4. And Professor Corley has written that deiodinase enzymes are the gatekeepers to thyroid hormone action. And the ratio of T3 to RT3 is your best indicator in both research and clinical application. So pay attention, guys. TSH is not the only test our patients need. Please, please, please write that on your heart. Okay. And here's a quote from a 2015 article. As a homeostatically integrated parameter, TSH is neither normatively fixed nor is it a precise marker of normal thyroidism.